Many artists today work solely with transparent watercolor, or transparent and semi-transparent paint. In fact, opaque watercolor is often a side thought or even shunned in some circles. But prior to the mid-1900s, watercolor often involved the use of opaque paints, especially white. Where today we work to save the whites of the paper or the surface, in the past, they were not as hesitant to include opaque white as one of their options. In fact, some masters used opaque white quite a bit in their work. We'll look at some examples in a minute, but first let me clarify something. Opacity is referring to the level of transparency, or how much of the layer underneath you can see. An opaque paint covers the layer underneath. Watercolor paints can be transparent, semi-transparent, semi-opaque, or opaque. Opaque watercolor is often called gouache, and in reality, gouache really is opaque watercolor. But true gouache usually includes an ingredient such as chalk or opaque white pigment, and the two similar forms of paint perform slightly differently. Because of the addition of chalk, calcium carbonate, or white opaque pigment, gouache tends to dry a little more quickly. And because those ingredients add white to the paint, the colored pigment load has to be heavier in order to bring the value of the paint down, making it less light. So the tinting strength of gouache tends to be stronger. To lighten the color of a naturally opaque watercolor paint, one that has larger pigment particles, you simply need to dilute it. To lighten the color of a gouache paint, you need to add white gouache. Both tend to have large particle sizes. Large particle watercolors tend to granulate, whereas gouache, likely because of the intense pigment load, does not. Opaque watercolor is made opaque by the nature of the pigment. In gouache, it's often due to the addition of white chalk or the white pigment. Very dark colored gouache, however, is made opaque through the intense pigment load of the larger pigment particles. Let's take a close look at a few masters who used opaque watercolor in their work. And we'll begin with this piece from the late 1700s. It's one of those pieces that you'd have to get really close to see that it's watercolor. Overall, it has a formal, detailed, directly painted feeling, not a fluid flowing look that many watercolors have today. I think we sometimes forget that it can be used this way. When we zoom in, you can see the layers easier. Look at the trunk of the tree. The artist used brown and black ink and black chalk, in addition to various colors of gouache. But the white gouache is most obvious, especially in the snow. If you look at the snow-covered roof, you can tell that it's more than just the white of the surface. It has a solid look to it. And you can see areas of paint stroking. Can you see that? Here's a closer look at the branching. Look over here. You can tell that this is actually painted over this neutral here. The white that we see all along the branches visually looks thick. It's been applied over the darks, and only an opaque white can do that. Now this dark is over the white, but generally the whites are opaque in appearance. Even the figures have that solid look, opaque paint directly painted. You can see brush strokes like what we see with egg tempera, but this paint has better coverage, it's thicker. Even his pants look dense. You don't see the white of the paper underneath. Now this painting is also mostly gouache. It's a beautiful piece. I love the colors. Notice how many of the colors, especially this one, have a cloudy feel, or pastel-like. You can tell that there's some white mixed in with many of the paints. Is this color transparent? I think I'd call that translucent or semi-transparent. But you can tell that they did add white to that same color to convey the blossoms up here. And white made the color more opaque. Even the blues up here are more opaque. Everything looks like it's sitting on top of the paper. The splatter here, Gouache is pretty much opaque watercolor, as we said, and you can see the useful visual effects you can get, as well as how it opens the door to a whole other approach to the medium. Here's yet another painting created using gouache, and you can see that it's directly painted as well. We'll zoom in a bit, and the first thing I notice is their white robes. You can almost see the artist's brush applying the paint here. You can even see the bristle lines, directly painted. The woman's hat with the blue ribbons appears to sit opaquely on the surface. Everything is layered and directly painted. All of the gold and the silver work was applied with opaque golds, grays, and whites. And look at all the detail work here. Can you see all the individual strokes? Everything layered with direct applications of paint, and masterfully done. Even at the very top, this almost has an oil painting appearance, doesn't it? Look at the individual strokes used to create the figure. Amazing detail throughout. The next painting is by Tissot, and it's another painting that's heavily gouache. The first thing that jumps out at you are the folds in the curtains. Look how opaque they are. That is very milky, very thickly applied. And then he diluted the paint more right here. It's more translucent. The light, almost periwinkle blue folds in her outfit are also very opaque, with less dilution, giving it a very solid appearance. This is the same color. It's still opaque, but without added white, a darker value to build the form. If we zoom into this figure, you can see these nice red lines, which are a purer form of opaque red. It doesn't appear to have much white, if any, but it still does seem to cover the light value underneath. You do have some white opaque here. And if we come over here, you can see the woman's face. You can see the individual brush marks directly painted in opaque. Look how they painted the hands, too, implying highlights with a translucent tinted white gouache. It's fun to study these paintings. Here's a cute piece, painted in the late 1800s. This is listed as being painted with watercolor and gouache. The white of the duck seems to show areas of linen canvas. Can you see that? With perhaps a thin wash of translucent white paint. And then you have some individual strokes here and there of opaque paint, both diluted to translucency and less diluted, dense white. Look at this intense creamy white dab right here. Gosh. And over here are some more translucent strokes, thinned opaque paint. The white petals of the daisies are directly painted with very opaque, hardly diluted gouache. This muted orange looks semi-transparent, but the lighter yellow looks opaque. Can you see the difference? You can also determine the order of layering through observation. See how the green here was applied over the blue? You can see that it's a little bit translucent because you can see how it crosses over the white. See the change in value there? The same is true here. You can see how this green-blue crosses over this brighter green. Here's another use for opaques. This is a darker painting, and in it, the artist uses opaque white, likely tinted with a blue-gray, to establish peaks of sky through the dark foliage. These areas of light were likely lost when he applied his darks, so when it was all dry, they were able to dab and splatter the opaque paint to convey the sky. And lastly, we have this piece, which would serve as part of a memorial album for a deceased artist. It's a lovely tribute, and it's painted in watercolor of various opacities. Many of the colors have that creamy look of gouache, such as these pink petals. It all looks fairly directly painted. Here's a close-up of the greens. Pretty opaque. And the brushes. Are you able to identify the opaque applications at this point? You can really see it here. and then this thickly painted white. Opaque watercolor or gouache is something that has been used for centuries, and it's something we shouldn't be afraid of incorporating today. Watercolor is a medium that can utilize the full range of transparency. The information in this video is taken from my online class, The Watercolor Process. See the video description for more information.